I am joined by members of my cabinet, and we'll have a brief update on the district's response to COVID, and then we will entertain your questions. Before that, however, I want to turn the microphone over to Chairman Mendelson. As we have done throughout the district's response to COVID, we have shared the podium in advance of the council sessions, and Mr. Mendelson will provide his regular briefing.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Good morning. As the mayor indicated, tomorrow is a legislative meeting, and I have a press conference before our legislative meetings, and it's easier on you all if we combine the press conferences. The legislative meeting tomorrow is what we call an additional meeting, not a regularly scheduled one. It will follow a regularly scheduled committee of the whole meeting. There are a number of bills that are going to be marked up in the committee of the whole. Of those, and I believe that my staff shared with you all the agenda, which was also put on the council's website on Friday, so that the public can see both the agenda for the committee of the whole and the legislative meeting. I'm not going to go through every bill, but at the committee of the whole, we will be marking up a bill that called the Electric Vehicle Readiness Amendment Act, which requires that in new construction or substantially renovated buildings, there has to be some infrastructure installed for electric vehicles, like electric automobiles, to try to help jumpstart the demand for electric vehicles. There are also two bills that are coming through the committee of the whole, introduced quite some time ago by Kenyon McDuffie, dealing with monuments and memorials to individuals in the city. One bill, the Diverse Washingtonians Commemoration Amendment Act, calls for a study group to recommend memorials so that we have more diversity in the city with who is represented, who's memorialized. I think there are only a couple of women who have memorials and only a few African Americans. The second bill is to continue an evaluation of monuments and markers and names of public spaces, and whether the council should be, with a recommendation expected to the council on whether there should be efforts to change names or monuments. Other bills, there's a bill that will be marked up for first reading that would establish for WMATA what we already have in place for MPD in the city, and that is an independent police complaints office. This would be an adjunct to WMATA, so it wouldn't be in the local government. And because this would be an amendment to the compact, we will be asking Maryland and Virginia to consider the same legislation. So that's going to be up for first reading tomorrow. A bill that's gotten some attention in the past, and I mentioned at the last press conference, I thought we would have the final vote on this a week ago, and that's the Minor Consent for Vaccinations Amendment Act. Mr. Gray has indicated that there will be an amendment which is fairly minor, and as I'm speaking, I can't even remember what the amendment does, but the bill had gone through on a 12-to-1 vote on first reading, and I expect it will be approved tomorrow, but that is on the agenda as well. There are only 3 emergencies on the bill, on the agenda. Emergencies are bills that be as soon as the mayor signs the legislation, assuming that she signs it, it becomes effective, but only lasts for 90 days. One is to improve the council's ability for oversight of police overtime. I think this is where council members are ending up with regard to, as you know, there was some controversy over the reprogramming proposal to make whole the police department for spending in fiscal year 2020, which has ended. And then there's a bill that deals with a contract at the convention center, and a third emergency, the final emergency, which is just some cleanup with regard to the Budget Support Act, getting that in place right away. That's really, as quickly as I can, the highlights for tomorrow's meeting. The next meeting after tomorrow will be December 1st. What we're seeing is an increase in the number of bills that are going through the council right now because we are nearing the end of council period 23. And any bills that don't come before the council on December 1st for first reading will die this council period and have to be reintroduced in the next council period. So that's why we're seeing a crush of business in the council. I'm happy to take questions, and I'll be sticking around during the rest of the press conference if there are questions later for me. Are there any questions? Yes, is that Perry?
Yes, yes. Can you explain more why you didn't put Alyssa Silverman's bill um, that gave guidelines on how to reopen schools on the agenda tomorrow? And, you know, the council's been fairly hands-off in terms of the reopening, how schools should reopen. Do you think her bill is an appropriate role for council? Why or why not?
Personally, I don't think it's appropriate for the council to adopt, but putting that aside, the proposal, which essentially would prohibit reopening schools unless certain conditions were met, was first dropped on Thursday. That's the first anybody saw it. My preliminary conversations with the mayor's legislative liaison was that the executive was not supportive of it and that there hadn't been any consultation with them. Now, you know, in the end, because the council is independent, we do what we think is best, without regard, with all due respect to what the mayor's position is. But here there hadn't been any consultation, and there needs to be some consultation before we go forward with a proposal. In addition, the way it was drafted, it would have given unilateral veto authority to any of the unions in the schools to prohibit, to block a reopening of the schools. In addition, the bill is written, one has to kind of think about this and think it through, but if one council member could block, could stall the reopening, and then the full council has to take it up, which is how what the bill provided, what does that say to the parents and to teachers with regard to when the school would open? So let's say the mayor proposes to open schools, and this is hypothetical, I have to emphasize this, that she proposes to open schools 3 weeks from now. And then one member files a resolution, then that reopening is stopped. And then the council on December 1st decides it's going to go forward. But of course, nobody knows until December 1st whether the council is going to go forward. The council on a 7-6 vote says, yes, we'll go forward with the reopening the schools. That's what, less than a week for everybody to figure out what they're going to do. That needs to be thought through more. And the fact of the matter is that I don't think any schools are reopening in the next 2 or 3 weeks, or even in the next 4 weeks, or longer. So we have time to look at this. And if Councilmember Silverman wants to go forward with it to fix those problems that I just mentioned.
And why don't you think it's, regardless of the details of the bill, why do you not think it's an appropriate matter for the council to weigh in on?
Are you going back to the very beginning of my answer?
Yeah.
Well, I was giving you my off-the-cuff reaction. You know, I think that if it was better developed, maybe I would have a different view. But I think the council needs to be careful that, you know, public education is not one of those areas that really lends itself to legislation. We're talking about quality of teaching. And so where the council has an important role is in oversight. That's not legislating. Now, I know that there's some who think that, well, this is important enough that we should be talking about it, and I agree. And then, in fact, that's why I suggested to Mr. Grasso, and he agreed that we're going to have another hearing on December 2nd about the ability to reopen our schools. So I do think that there needs to be discussion, but a bill is not the best way to just simply evoke discussion. Hearings, roundtables, that's the way to do the discussion. I think I saw another hand, yes?
Yes, thank you. You mentioned the bill that's been introduced on police overtime. Do you support that bill?
I think it will be going to the council tomorrow. And I have to look at it again, but I expect I'll be voting for it.
Do you feel that
because I see it as being an oversight mechanism.
Do you feel that the way that the police overtime was introduced and handled this summer worked, system was appropriate, or that process needs to change?
How do I want to answer that? I think it's very, very difficult to second guess the cost of, excuse me, I don't know what's happening to my voice. It's very difficult to second guess the cost of policing when there are demonstrations in the city. I certainly, even though I used to chair judiciary and worked with MPD and other law enforcement issues for 8 years, I don't have the expertise to say that the chief hired too many people or not enough people. When I say hired, I mean kept them on duty for a First Amendment demonstration. And of course, sometimes we know after the fact what that demonstration was like, that it was not as big as we expected, or it wasn't violent when we thought it would be. I think it's really hard to second guess the overtime costs for fiscal year 2020. Having said that, that doesn't mean that it wouldn't be appropriate for the council to have an oversight hearing, sorry, Chief, and ask, why were the expenses that high? I want to remind you the issue with regard to that reprogramming, which I think is the impetus for this emergency. That reprogramming is about the federal government not reimbursing us for expenses that they traditionally have reimbursed us for. I mean, these are, like we saw it over the weekend. As I recall, the demonstrators weren't coming to town because they were upset with the district government. They were upset about national issues. And it was I'll say, a nationally focused protest. And it's great that we're the nation's capital, but these are costs that we bear on a local basis because of the nation's capital, the federal presence.
If I may ask one more question. You mentioned that this is the end of the year and anything that's going to get in needs to get in by December 1st. Can you tell us what your priorities are? And perhaps the mayor could also tell us what her priorities are for final bills to get in before the end of the year.
With regard to the committee of the whole, we're going through bills on which we've had hearings and seeing which ones had positive support when we had the hearing on them, and that we think we can get through. And I think that's what the other committees are doing. This is really, I hate to put it this way because it doesn't sound very positive, but it's sort of the cleanup period where committees are trying to get the bills out of committee that they had been meaning to work on all year. And of course, our business was slowed down because of the pandemic. So there's a lot that committees were hoping to move that now they're trying to sort that out. Mr. Rice.
Yes, I don't know if you saw two references to local politics in statehood in the Post yesterday. One, I get to see the Post today, and this column co-authored by Michael K. Fontroy, in which he says, the Democrats would have to win both races to have even a serious chance for statehood bill to be considered in the Senate. In general, what is your thoughts about the election, in general, the national election, and of course, what it means for statehood?
I'll take that as three parts. First, I think it does not help with the optimism that we were feeling earlier this fall, that statehood had a real chance next year. One, I learned a long time ago, never say never, so I'm not going to write it off, but it wasn't positive in that regard. Now I'm blanking on the rest of your question. The election. I think I would make two comments. One is that, this is me personally speaking, that I think the White House has been a real danger to democracy and the traditions, including law and order and respect for law in this country. So I think the election was positive with regard to the view of the public that we need a better approach, one that looks or tries to speak to the soul of America. I mean, the other way of looking at the election was we were optimistic that we would see many more friends in Congress, both the House and the Senate, and that was disappointing. So I'm hopeful, though, that the president-elect will make as a priority trying to combat the polarization. Maybe I shouldn't use such a strong word, to reduce the polarization and to try to heal the divisiveness that's been given a green light over the last 4 years. Mitch.
There's a budget amendment on the agenda for tomorrow, and part of it is set some rules for how the housing authority can spend some funds. Can you explain what that does and the impetus for that?
I'm going to have to get back to you on the housing authority. I think you're talking about the Budget Clarification Act. That's kind of a cleanup bill. I don't believe there's anything controversial there. It may be, and you should follow up with me afterwards, it may be that the issue there was that we, in the budget, put a substantial amount of money to public housing for repair and maintenance of the housing units. I should say repair. And we realized afterwards that we needed to be more clear about exactly how that money gets out the door, what the housing authority has to do, and what the approval processes are, and that this is technical to fix that, to be clear. As far as I know, there's no controversy with regard to any of the provisions in the Budget Support Clarification Act. It's where matters have been brought to us by the mayor or by the chief financial officer or even by council attorneys that we need to clarify or fix some language. Mr. Rice.
You had 2 long hearings on the comprehensive plan, and you said bills have to be reintroduced if they don't pass this year. What happens with the comprehensive plan?
We have the ability, and we did this 2 years ago, to hold over that bill and to reintroduce it as introduced by the mayor. And that's my intent, so that we'll be able to act on it in January or February. Was there more to your question?
No.
Okay. As I said, I'm not going away, so if there are more questions, call me back. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, I'm going to move through our slides quickly, and then we will take your questions. Let's post today's metrics. This morning on coronavirus.dc.gov, we showed that we have 87 new cases of COVID in our community. And unfortunately, we report no lives lost today. Dr. Nesbitt will be available for further comment. We also want to highlight a trend that we've seen in recent cases. In the last week, almost half of our new cases were from people 25 to 44 years old. And it is particularly high for the population in that 25 to 34-year-old range. We will also show at some point, I guess, I assume that it's showing on television, that there's a closer breakdown of the 25 to 44-year-old population by gender and race. 53% were female, were women, and 47% were men. 32% identified as Black, non-Hispanic, while 38% identified as white, non-Hispanic. This slide is a reminder of our shared responsibility. So continue to look at the age group of those who are becoming affected. They are not the same age group as those who are losing their lives to COVID, which continue to predominate the 60-plus age group. And ultimately, none of us know how the virus will affect us, so we have to do everything that we can to prevent exposure to the virus. And through contact tracing, we have a sense of where people are getting exposed. The highest category continues to be social events, which includes small gatherings of family and friends. So again, we ask you to continue to limit your exposure to other people, stay home more, in other words, wear a mask, even around friends and family, keep 6 feet apart, and continue to practice good hand hygiene. It is highly recommended that DC residents only celebrate Thanksgiving with the people who live in their home. However, if someone comes into your home, keep masks on, and when you take them off to eat or drink, remain 6 feet apart. Do things differently. We recommend create different traditions. Don't crowd around a dining table. It's just simply not the year to do that. We also expect that some families will have young people returning home from college, and these young people perhaps will be here for the rest of the year, not returning after Thanksgiving. So if your family has a young adult returning to DC from a state with 10 or more cases per 100,000, please follow our travel advisory. They should limit their daily activities and self-monitor for 14 days, or limit their daily activities for 3 to 5 days, then get tested and continually limit activities until they receive a negative test. I've now asked the Chancellor to briefly update us on CARE classrooms in the district.
Good morning. Thank you, Mayor. DCPS is excited to open a limited number of CARE classroom. CARE represents Canvas Academics Real Engagement in 29 of our elementary schools. Staff is under professional development today, tomorrow, and we will welcome students back at 29 of our schools. In the 29 schools served, we'll have approximately 56 classrooms of CARE supports, and we have the capacity to serve approximately 600 students. The community is welcome to get more information about our CARE model. They can go to our website at dcpsreopenstrong.com, and there's additional information on our CARE classroom. As a reminder, for the CARE model, students will continue to learn remotely. However, they will be doing that within a CARE classroom and be supervised by a DCPS employee or a trusted partner. We also have the support of patient care technicians, which will provide additional support for screening, health checks, and the ability to man and manage our isolation rooms for any symptomatic individual within the school building. We are also going to ramp up our CARE classrooms over the next couple of weeks. This is just phase 1 of implementation, and we'll continue to reach out to families. We first prioritize those students that have previously accepted a in-person learning seat. For the CARE classroom experience, students will arrive on campus and complete a health check. There's a sanitizing station. They'll also receive their face covering for the day, which will be required throughout the day. They'll also receive meals. There'll be morning activities. Students will have the ability to have lunch in their classroom. There'll also be scheduled recess time for students, and there'll be afternoon activities and closing activities for the day. In addition to the academic supports that will be taking place during this time, this is also an important time for students to socialize with their peers and activities that support social and emotional development. Thank you.
Thanks, Chancellor. Any questions? Yes, Sam.
Chancellor, you were saying that 600 students are going to be here. I'm just wondering,
is that all all the parents that wanted their kids in? Because I know the original number was much higher than that.
Yeah, so this is the capacity for phase one. We will enter into our next phase after the Thanksgiving holiday, and then we'll continue to add additional seats and phases as we go into 2021. And then in the spring, we'll continue to expand as well.
But basically, you provided services to everyone that signed up at this point?
So we prioritize those students who had already been offered and accepted an in-person learning seat. As we prepared to offer in-person learning, we wanted to ensure that those families who had been expecting and planning for a in-person experience had the first choice. And then we offered to other students that were in our categories to be prioritized, which includes those students that are experiencing homelessness, those students that are receiving special education services, those students that are language learners, and then those students that are identified as at risk.
Did anybody apply who did not get in?
And so we have offered seats to all those that have accepted a seat. And so schools are then offering other seats to students in their building based on their categories. So at this point, anybody who accepted a seat would have been offered a seat at this time.
Chancellor, can I follow up?
Yes.
You say you have capacity for 600 students in phase one. Will you have 600 students in phase one? And do you know how many will show? And this is when, this week, Wednesday, right? So
This is this week, Wednesday, yes.
do you know how many students you anticipate showing up?
That is a moving target. As of Friday, we had over 400 of the families had already accepted those seats that we have available to start this week. And we'll continue to reach out to families today and tomorrow as well as we prepare for Wednesday.
So I'm sorry, so 400 have accepted?
Yep, as of Friday, over 400 families had accepted.
Thank you.
Yes, Perry?
Yeah, does any school will they have more than 2 classrooms open at any school? And are you worried about a possible legislation impeding your plans?
And so there are schools that will have more than 2 classrooms. The maximum number of classes that we have seen in the building right now for phase one is approximately 5 classrooms in a particular school building. That is a result of some of the partnerships those schools may have had that we are leveraging those staff to help us with our care classrooms. We do not believe that the legislation that was put forth is a smart way to address the reopening of our schools, whether that be in-person learning or our care classrooms. We believe that we have done the due diligence with health and safety, and we have collaborated with our union partners along with our school communities.
Dr. Fairby, you are preparing for thousands of students to return to these care classrooms. What does it say to you that only around 400 are going?
We've always said that this would be a ramp up. We've always said that we would ramp up over time period. What we shared is that our capacity allows us to serve approximately 21,000 students. That's utilizing every space in our elementary schools, but we never indicated that that would be a large dose at one point in time.
Do you have a list of the schools the 29 schools that will be opening? And what made a school open versus a school not open?
Yes, we do have the list of the 29 schools. We can share those with you. The driving factor right now is staffing at that particular school. In this first phase, we're only utilizing the staff at that particular school, and we're utilizing partners. So if a school had a larger number of partners that were serving and before after school care, that gave them additional capacity. I think you have the schools listed before you now. But again, that represents the list of the 29 elementary schools.
Thank you.
Now, if I understand correctly, you said these students were chosen from the people who had already been offered and accepted an in-person teaching slot, right?
Correct.
So the in-person teaching folks, those were the ones that were having a hard time learning on a computer with distance learning, that were chosen because they needed to be in a room with a teacher. CARES isn't really going to offer that to them. How is CARES going to be able to bridge that gap? If they're still basically doing distance learning with a non-teacher potentially in the room.
Yeah, that could be one of the challenges in terms of the success with learning at home. However, we did hear from a number of parents. One of the challenges is for parents and guardians to be engaged with learning at home and to be able to provide supports and supervision accordingly. And so that's why we first reached out to those in-person learning families that accepted a seat to see if they were interested in this particular model. Some were not. But there were many that were interested in this model and believe that this would better serve their child and their particular family situation.
Other questions?
Non-school question. Dr. Nesbitt, I'm wondering if you could help. We got a statement from your office about hospitals and surge capacity and the metrics. And I'm just wondering if you could help clarify what it means. And what I'm really trying to get at is what has to happen? Is it a metric that we hit, or is it one hospital hits 100% for the overflow at the convention center to be activated? Because
Sure.
we saw us go up to 90% capacity last week in the hospital.
Sure, it's a fantastic question, Mark. So we have, since the beginning of COVID-19, experienced oscillations in capacity across the district's acute care hospital system. As you know, the healthcare system in the district has hospitals that specialize in different types of care, depending on the hospital and the health system. And that's how most cities manage their health system capacity or their healthcare services. The District of Columbia has what's called a Certificate of Need program. It's a program that was established decades ago, and about half of the states continue to have that program. Because we have a Certificate of Need program, not all of our hospitals offer the same types of services. So some of them have more specialized cancer services, some of them have more specialized orthopedic services. We have a specialty pediatric service hospital in the District of Columbia that serves pediatric patients from across our region, some of them receiving more specialized care, some of them being admitted for more general pediatrics. And because of that, not all of our hospitals have what we call inpatient pediatrics or admit children who need an overnight stay. Because of this unique way of which our acute care hospitals or inpatient hospitals manage their service offerings, they will have different fluctuations in their patient volumes for different reasons. If their plastic surgeons are offering procedures that require overnight stay at different levels of volumes or not, you may see a fluctuation in any individual hospital's utilization over time. Since the beginning of COVID, we've had some hospitals, all of whom built additional capacity within their hospital, right, to handle a surge. So they fluctuated how they would use what we call post-anesthesia care units for ICU units if we needed to have more patients on ventilators. They did a full, basement to top of the hospital walkthrough with the Army Corps of Engineers to see how the space could be used differently. Even looking at auditoriums and cafeteria space to say, how can we surge within our own hospital facility, which is the best place to care for patients before you move to what we call field hospitals, right? Setting up space outside the hospital in the parking lot, building the alternate care site over at Walter E. Washington Convention Center, really maximizing that space within the hospital. Because of that unique or the situation that I described with each of our hospitals sort of specializing in different things, having more unique characteristics or offering the services, all of them can handle emergencies, right? 911, you call 911, an ambulance takes you to the nearest hospital that could stabilize you and provide you the care that you need. But all of them have experienced different fluctuations in their utilization. Some of them have already, on a day-to-day basis, gone above 85, 90%, 95% of their individual hospital capacity on a day-to-day basis. The metric that we report on coronavirus.dc.gov is a metric of how our overall system has managed its capacity, including that sometimes surge capacity in an individual hospital since March. What would be required for us to activate the convention center is that we would be exceeding collectively across our system that capacity that was built internally in multiple hospitals on a consistent basis. So not just one hospital triggering over 100% of its capacity, but we would have multiple hospitals that were operating above capacity in order for us to do that. So the way that our hospitals work very collaboratively, the way that we work with our fire and EMS system is that we move patients to the best place for them to get the level of care that they need, whether that care be an ICU bed, whether that care be a prolonged inpatient stay, or whatever type of specialty care that they need. We would move patients within our existing hospital infrastructure before we triggered the use of any field resources or alternate care sites.
So I appreciate that. So when you say you need multiple hospitals to reach capacity, you mean reach 100% capacity?
It doesn't necessarily have to be 100% capacity. It has to be what are the resources that we need, right? So if you have patients who need an ICU bed or an intensive care unit bed or a ventilator bed, and we've maximized that capacity, and the alternate care site is designed to be step-down services, we may have to move because of that reason. But all hospitals may not be at 100% of their capacity. So remember that the way that we've restructured in the district is not just about counting the number of ICU beds that are in use at baseline, because some of that additional capacity, as I described it, and I was intentional with that, is that we've looked at things like post-anesthesia care unit beds that aren't an ICU bed on an everyday basis that can be converted to an ICU bed. So we have the ability to build additional capacity within our existing hospital infrastructure for ICU and general admissions before we move out to that that alternate care site.
Appreciate that.
Right. Yeah, so the number that we report on a regular basis is the capacity of our baseline facilities.
Right. Thank you.
I just asked Dr. Ness to confirm that, because the number, she mentioned a number of things, but the number we report is the normal capacity of the hospital. So our normal capacity today, for example, and I don't have on my glasses, is 84.3%. Dr. Nesbitt also mentioned that in most hospitals, there's built-in surge capacity on the campus. That's not reflected in this number. In addition to that, there's the Walter Washington Convention Center. Okay, any other questions? Yes.
Hi, Laura from City Paper. I think this might be for Dr. Nesbitt. Thank you for having me today. So the new data that you shared today says that 25.8% of COVID cases came from restaurant or bar activity. And my question is, does this distinguish between indoor and outdoor dining? And if not, why? Because the distinction seems like it'd be helpful in informing any decisions about future rollbacks, and even some operators themselves are wondering where the safest place is to see customers.
Yes, thank you for the question, and I've received tremendous interest in that particular metric. And if you'll indulge me, I'll give another long answer to that question as someone grabs me some water. So I do too, and I was going to say, and the mayor and I are both mindful about the footwear we have today in an unseated press briefing. So one of the things, I'll give this little quick story. We have our calls audited that we do with all of our positive cases, and I'll ask people to recognize that when our contact tracers are interviewing someone, we're talking to someone who now has a diagnosis of COVID-19. For many of us who love data, it's an opportunity for us to learn more about the circumstances by which they've become infected. For the person who's infected, they are giving information, but they also want someone to tell them, am I going to survive this? What's the likelihood that I could be hospitalized? How much of a risk am I in for other people? So it's a very anxiety-provoking moment. The way that we structure our interviews, they're designed to get information that's informative both in the management of the individual, but also in the management of the overall situation. A couple weeks ago, one of the persons who audits our calls asked me if it's time for me to give consideration to shorten the length of the interview, right? So oftentimes in these briefings or in the flood of emails I get, I'm being asked, are we considering adding additional questions? So I have to balance the auditors who are asking me to shorten the calls because they're listening and people are getting fatigued with the duration of the calls. Engagement with the interview begins to dwindle after 10 minutes. These calls are around sometimes 24, 25 minutes long before you even get to asking, now give me the list of the people you've been around. So there's a balance between ascertaining additional information that will not necessarily help us manage their specific case or the pandemic at large in the district, and just getting more data points that we can report out on that are of interest to the curious people, including myself. So when we talk about this distinction of if someone has done indoor dining or outdoor dining, which is a question we get almost weekly, does it really add to the public health knowledge around what we know about the risk of indoor activities versus outdoor activities? It doesn't. So us asking people who report to us that they have dined during the 2 weeks before their diagnosis, us adding additional levels of questions in our algorithm that prolongs the interview, we from a public health perspective don't necessarily see additional value in that. While it would help us answer the question that we get additionally in this room, it doesn't add additional value. Why? We know that places that have decreased ventilation have increased risk for transmission, and those places don't necessarily have to just be rooms like this. Tents that have 3 sides have decreased ventilation over a tent that has 2 sides, right? Because you don't have the ability to get crosswinds. The same thing about these igloos. They are enclosed with a small opening. They have increased opportunities for transmission over anything that would be constructed that has the opportunity for crosswinds. And there are case studies that have been documented that explain this increased risk for transmission. So as you have posed the question about restaurant operators who are looking to winterize, this notion that you can continue to bring people indoors and it doesn't have an increased risk of transmission because DC Health's contact tracing data doesn't show you that, would be a flawed assumption for anyone who operates an indoor venue to make. We need to shift away from trying to prove a negative by using a data set and go with the obviously established public health science that indoor activities are higher risk than outdoor activities and be guided by that science.
Yeah, that makes sense. The only reason why it's tricky is because if you look at all the jurisdictions that are making their decisions last week and this week that are deciding to close indoor dining, close outdoor dining, it seems like you'd want that data set, but I understand that point.
Sure, and so what I would say to that question is that we're continuing to monitor the data. I think that you'll be, if the district gets to a place where we're making decisions on things to move back, we'll be both guided by local data and broad public health science on how we make our recommendations for rolling back.
And I just want to say something else. It happens to be one of my pet peeves, but we report restaurant and bar information, though we don't have open bars in the district, and we haven't throughout the response to this emergency. So somebody who is reporting to the district may have been to a bar someplace else. So I just want to be clear about that. Yes. Sure.
And this is just another, you didn't ask this question, but I get this question all the time too. And while we're on this slide, we highlight 6 activities that are considered, we consider to be high risk or medium risk exposures. And some people have lost sight of what we talk about as being the household exposures. You'll notice that about 42% of the folks who were interviewed last week don't report any activities related to, in the past 2 weeks, I didn't work outside the home, I didn't go to a bar or restaurant, I didn't attend a social event. many of these folks have had a household exposure. And the reason why I've asked for the opportunity to highlight that is that some people are not reporting these exposures, but they live in a household with someone who may have participated in these activities. And that individual themselves did not have a test, may have had mild symptoms or no symptoms at all, and was never diagnosed, but could have been the source infection in that home. And this is one of the phenomena that is increasingly common, especially for individuals who live in multi-generational homes, or are the folks who are least likely to identify their own symptoms and are continuing to spread the virus around the community. So I really wanted to make sure that people recognize this concept or construct of folks who aren't reporting these high-risk exposures, but still fall in this category of household exposures that should not be overlooked or not identified as an ongoing source of transmission in the District of Columbia and around the U.S.
Got it. Okay, we're going to do one last round. Yes.
Very quick health question on a lot of the protesters that were in town over the weekend were not wearing masks, less than half, well below half. Any impact of that on the virus numbers would show up Wednesday, Thursday? Is that right? Is my math right?
So we continue to learn more about the virus. I'm sorry, but this talking really gets to you. We continue to learn more about the virus and when the optimal times for an individual to begin to show symptoms, or when their higher levels of virus may be present in their symptoms and may be present on the test. We've always recommended that individuals who may have had an exposure, so participated in large-scale events, been somewhere who is still not wearing a mask these days continues to blow my mind, but would be optimal for them to be tested within the 3 to 5 days since that exposure. However, given what we call the incubation period of the virus, so when you've had an exposure, when you may still show signs and symptoms of that exposure, is up to 14 days. So when those trends could manifest in our data is up to 2 weeks from those major events. But we recommend that individuals would be tested 3 to 5 days after they may have had an exposure.
Yes. Can I just ask, while we're on that topic of everyone in town in DC this weekend, we were talking to a number of people who were from the states that were on your list of high-risk states. Pretty sure they didn't quarantine. So many people without masks, even though there are mask mandates in the city. How do you expect, and how do you plan to enforce and hope that people will follow the recommendations for the Thanksgiving holiday, and we're seeing them violated left and right in this?
We expect people, and I don't, we know, and this is not a phenomenon unique to the district, that there are people who have the belief that masks are some symbol of their political ideology. We just don't subscribe to those views here in the district. And we have seen over the last 8 months, district residents take the guidance from DC Health very seriously. So we continue to ask our residents to do that. We've added to our discussion today another thing that we want DC families to pay attention to, and that is their college student coming home. Many colleges and universities are offering tests. We would ask families to talk to their students now about how they can schedule a test before they come home. Isolate when they get home, get a test 3 to 5 days after they arrive, and stay home until they get a negative test result. If they're not going to plan to do that testing regime, they should stay home for 14 days. Yes.
I'm wondering about, over the weekend, I believe you released a number of weapons that were confiscated. Were you able to break that down? Are you able to break that down and tell us what type of weapons those were? Were they handguns? Were they assault rifles? And what were the circumstances? Were people brandishing them open carry? Or is there anything you can kind of provide in that, you know?
Yeah, so we recovered 8 firearms over the weekend that were associated with the demonstrations that we had downtown. 3 of those arrests were situations where folks were open carrying. One of the arrests was a person who had brought a car in a vehicle, and another arrest was a person who was arrested for assault and ended up having a firearm in his possession.
Do you know if any of those were handguns versus assault rifles?
Most of the 7 of the 8 were handguns. One of the guns is an in between a rifle and a handgun. It's a very unique weapon.
Okay. And then, can you talk about, prior to this, I think most people, when we had the press conference prior to this, you weren't expecting such a large crowd. Can you talk about why you weren't expecting such a large crowd, and we've got a bigger crowd than expected, and how that kind of played out, and then how the president's pass-through played out in security?
So I mean, I could tell you this: we always prepare for the worst and hope for the best. The size of a crowd is really not the issue with regards. It's how the folks in the crowds behave. And so I think over the course of the weekend, particularly on Saturday, I was very impressed with the way that the Metropolitan Police Department was able to prevent more conflicts than we did have. It was actually quite remarkable. Not sure another agency in the country could have handled that.
What was the worst of it, Chief? I mean, how did it, you know, it's Saturday, but what did it?
The worst of it for me is, and I was talking to Dr. Nesbitt before we came in here today, was to see our country having those types of physical disputes over an election. That's something we attribute to other countries across the world, but we don't see that here in the United States, so that's the worst of it for me.
But you thought your people handled it well?
They did outstanding work under very difficult circumstances. We heard all the conversation about people not wearing masks and COVID. Men and women of the Metropolitan Police Department went out there, put themselves in harm's way to ensure that our city was safe. I couldn't be more proud of them.
And can you talk about that, Chief? Is there a protocol where you have your officers standing in where they have to be, and they're surrounded by people who are screaming and are not wearing masks? Are your officers then, as a part of protocol, tested afterward, or what happens as far as those officers?
We are certainly going to give that some consideration for the folks that were in close contact to the large groups to get them tested. As you heard from the health professionals, that would occur within the next 3 to 5 days.
So you will be getting them tested?
We're going to give that some consideration, yes. Yes?
There's a lot of videos out there showing some of the protesters who came to town taking down the artwork and things from the fence at Black Lives Matter Plaza, and a lot of kind of hard feelings about that, and saying, oh, the MPD should have done something about that. Is that just an unrealistic expectation? Is there anything?
That's a judgment call by the incident commander on the scene, whether or not our interaction in that action is going to exacerbate the situation. So you have to make it on a case-by-case basis. If it's a large crowd and it's dangerous, the police are unlikely to go in there, which can make the situation worse. If it's a few people, we may go up there and try and correct the behavior. So it's a hard call. We have to leave that call to the officials on the scene. Yes?
Downtown is boarded up. You think it's downtime that they can safely take the boards down?
We've never made recommendations for boarding up here in the city. There was very little property damage this weekend. So, people have to make their own decisions on their own personal property, but we never as a city made recommendations for boarding up. Yes?
One of the incidents that got a lot of attention was a van that was stabbed multiple times. Can you just go through what you know happened there, and what is anything known about the political affiliation of that?
Yeah, that was one of the conflicts that we had. It was in the 1000 block of New York Avenue. The victim in that case received some pretty serious stab wounds to his back. We do not know who the suspects are. Our detectives are going through that area to see if they can get any video. Some of the witnesses on the scene, frankly, were uncooperative and did not provide a lot of information regarding a lookout. So we would ask anybody who saw anything or perhaps captured an image of that incident to share it with us. You can call 202-727-9099. We can find a way for that information to get to our investigators.
And then there's another one, the video's getting a lot of attention. This involves a group of, what looks like a gentleman. The president retweeted, first the president shared a slow-mo video of a guy getting hit in the back by a counter-protester. Then other videos have been going around calling on MPD to take action so they shows that man who involved in other altercations, but the people with the counter-protesters there are the ones whose photos are in major outlets being investigated. Tell us any more about that incident and that one man involved.
So there was as you said, there was an assault at 17th and I that garnered a lot of social media attention. It looked like a very serious assault. There were 4 arrests from that scene. When we make an arrest, that's really the infancy stages of the investigation. So we're going to have to, gather more video, talk to witnesses, and see exactly what happened there. The video itself is very disturbing. You saw somebody get hit from behind, had a pretty serious injury. But there's also some information that suggests that the person who was struck may have provoked that. So those are all the things we got to take a look at.
Quick question for Mayor Bowser for CNN. Can you tell me a little bit about this Hyatt Regency meeting of GOP members of Congress this week? 240 people inside. The Phase 2 guidance says no meetings over 50 people. We've heard that there's a waiver that was issued by the Department of Health. You heard anything about that?
Thank you. I'm Chris Rodriguez, Director of Homeland Security Emergency Management here in the district. We worked with DC Health and the Office of the Attending Physician at the House. We knew that a waiver was coming from members of the House to hold a meeting. DC Health reviewed their plans, and a waiver was approved. The work of Congress, as we've said before, is an essential function of government. And so after the plan was reviewed and approved, we issued the waiver.
It seems like an interesting double standard, though. I mean, cases are spiking across the country. The guidance says only folks from the National Capital Region will be allowed to meet in hotels less than 50. So why do this now?
Well, as I mentioned, since the beginning of the pandemic, we have identified what is essential and non-essential. And so the work of Congress is an essential function of government.
Mayor Bowser, any reaction?
I don't really have much to add to that question because we are the seat of the federal government. The Congress meets here. There are 435 members of the House. There's been an election, and those new members are reporting to town, and they have to be able to work. We actually prefer when there are waiver requests because we can have the district's agencies opine and make recommendations for safer operation. And that we are able to do that, especially in the case where one of our commercial establishments is being used as opposed to a federal facility. Any last questions? 1, 2, 3. Yes.
Chancellor, are any WTU members, meaning people represented by the WTU, whether they're teachers, counselors, whatever, being used for the care classrooms or the small groups reopening? Meaning reporting to the
Yes, Perry, there are WTU members that have volunteered to serve. There are not significant numbers, but there are some.
In the care classrooms or small group learning?
Small group learning.
Small group learning, okay. Thanks.
Sam?
And I don't know, maybe repeat something you've already said, but cut back in restaurant capacity. I know what's happening in some areas in Maryland and I think Prince George's County. Is that in the cards here? Or?
Sam, I want to highlight something, and then I mentioned it last week, but we see a number of rollbacks in jurisdictions that surround us, and we're happy to see that because now they're coming more in line with where we've been throughout the response to the pandemic. We will continue to monitor our metrics very closely, and if we determine that there's something that needs to change that will impact our caseload, then we will certainly do some outreach and make those announcements, but we don't have anything to announce today. Yes?
With regards to businesses fined, we were told that on Saturday and Sunday, Harry's was cited twice for violating COVID. Can we get your response to that, number one? MAGA supporters that are known to be frequent gun laws? And then secondly, have any other businesses or locations in the district been cited in the same way?
Yes, I don't have those numbers off the top. Perhaps John will know and be able to add. And it doesn't matter who goes to Harry's to us. It matters that they follow the rules. That's the patrons and that's the business owners. So whose supporters they are matters not to us. We want the patrons to be safe, but we also want our residents who work in those bars and restaurants and hotels to be safe as well. Now, Harry's is an establishment that's been around a long time. They know what the rules are, and we will continue to look at their history with working with us during this pandemic to make sure that they have all the resources and tools that they need to comply. Okay, thank you.